In 1990, in Victoria, Australia, a family sat on the brink. Before them was a crossroads, and two parents had a difficult decision to make. John and Linda Burns had been unhappy in their marriage for quite some time, and things just didn't seem to be getting any better. Eventually, John and Linda made a call and decided to part ways, leaving their two daughters to pick between two households. Barbie Burns was 12 years old and the youngest of the Burns daughters. She decided to move in with Linda, but her older sister, Fiona, had a different idea. Fiona was 15, she wore black clothes, was quiet and liked science, and when it came to choosing between whether she wanted to live with her mother or father, she chose to live with John. Life as a teenager is complicated and difficult enough, and with all the family drama thrown into the mix as well, Fiona had a hard time coming to terms with the new changes in her life. To cope, she ran away from home, started living with an aunt, and then ran away from home again. About 3 times she disappeared without a trace, and each time she showed up again in Adelaide, about an 8 to 9 hour drive from her home. But of course Fiona was still only 15. She didn't have a car, and even if she did, she couldn't legally drive it. This meant that she, like so many other people across the world at the time, had to try her luck hitchhiking all the way down to Adelaide. This meant that the 8-9 hour drive could take a whole day, maybe even days if she was unlucky and couldn't find anyone to give her a lift. But it was a trip she, for whatever reason, kept making. The Burns had no family in Adelaide, and Fiona didn't have any friends apart from the ones she'd made during these trips down there, so no one knew why she chose to go there whenever she was working through something. She didn't explain what kept calling her to Adelaide herself either, but for her family, they were just happy that they now knew where to look when she went missing. Aside from the 3 occasions she'd run away to Adelaide, Fiona was a good kid. She did well in school and was naturally intelligent, but there was something about her parents' separation that seemed to strike a chord with Fiona, and she couldn't let go. By October 1990, Fiona had run away again and was on her 3rd trip to Adelaide. She was keeping in contact, but she didn't make any mention of wanting to return home until it came somewhat out of the blue. That autumn, she called home and told her father that she was on her way back and was bringing a surprise with her. John didn't ask what it was, but he was just happy that his daughter was coming home, and he sent her money to buy a bus ticket so she didn't have to hitchhike the long journey home. A few days came and went, and there was no sign of Fiona. John and Linda tried not to get too worried, especially because Fiona had always eventually come home before. There was a huge chance that Fiona had gotten the money and had chosen to hitchhike anyway, which meant that it could take her a good few days to get home if no one could give her a lift. But by the time a week had passed and Fiona hadn't called to explain what was taking her so long, they knew that something was wrong. John and Linda reported Fiona as missing to the police, but it would take them about another week to find out where Fiona had gone, almost right after making that phone call to her father. A couple in a truck stop in Border Town, about 1.5 kilometres away from the border between Victoria and South Australia, stopped their car and headed out along the side of the road to stretch their legs. They were looking for seeds to take home to plant in their garden, but they ended up finding something else entirely. Lying on the side of the road was a young woman, covered in blood and deceased. Not wanting to see any more than they had already, the couple raced back to the truck stop to call in the gruesome discovery to police, who then rushed to the scene and discovered so much more. The young woman had been stabbed to death, and she wasn't alone. Approximately 50 metres away was a young man who had been killed in the exact same way. That evening, going off of the clothes that the female victim had been wearing, the police called John Burns and informed him that his daughter had been killed. Unable to face the facts and the mother of his child alone, John Burns then went to Linda's 2 sisters to help him break the news. Linda's sisters then went to their father, and together all 4 of them went to Linda's home to tell her and Barbie what had happened to Fiona. In a later interview, Barbie said that no words were spoken between her parents. Linda simply looked up, and when she heard everyone coming into the house, and when she met John's eyes, Linda just knew that her daughter was gone. What followed was a frenzied search for a killer, and a media sensation that plastered Fiona's face on practically every front page of every newspaper all across the country. A nation went into fear over the tragic death of the two teenagers who'd been caught off guard, doing something that was completely normal for everyone without a car to do at the time. Terrified, so many parents warned their children of the dangers of hitchhiking and of falling in with the wrong kind of people, because again, Fiona hadn't been found alone. Also beside her was a 14-year-old boy called John Lee. John Lee lived in a group home in Adelaide and was basically living on the streets by the time that he and Fiona had struck out on that road trip. Fiona had met him during her second trip to Adelaide and had clearly met up with him again during her third. We're not sure exactly what the two teenagers were to each other. Maybe they were just friends, maybe there were more, but Fiona's family have their own beliefs about John Lee. They think that the surprise that Fiona had been talking about over the phone with her father had actually been John Lee, and that she was bringing him home to meet everyone else. But what is clear is that at some point, for whatever reason, the two teenagers had decided to hitchhike instead of taking the bus, and that was probably the decision that led them to their fate. There were several witnesses that put them on the road between Adelaide and Victoria during that period, asking for lifts or cigarettes, and sometimes in the company of a much older woman. But when police later pointed the finger at Fiona and blamed her own murder on her falling into the wrong crowd, they weren't referring to John Lee, and they weren't referring to the older woman they were later seen with either. It all started with something that the police had found in Fiona's backpack. This discovery had Fiona branded as a Satanist, and after that, rumour after rumour about her trips and the company she kept continued to grow. The next thing anyone knew, media outlets were claiming that Fiona and John were cult members who regularly skinned dogs and drank their blood, or just sacrificed them in some sort of devil worship. And this was all because the police found a Buffy the Vampire Slayer book in Fiona's bag. That was all it took for a teenage girl growing up in the 90s to be publicly branded as a Satanist. Her family talked to outlet after outlet, trying to combat the image the world was being presented of their daughter, but in the meantime, there was nothing from John Lee's family. They never got involved with any of the investigations or the press and simply seemed to move on. But Fiona's family fought for their killer to be brought to justice, and they are still fighting to this day. There was a brief theory, and one that Fiona's mother Linda actually put the most weight on, in that Ivan Milat, the infamous backpacker killer, could have been behind the murders of the two teenagers. Their murders did fit his modus operandi, but the investigators were unable to tie them to him or make it fit with his known locations during that time period. The theory for the most part was put to bed, but that meant that the investigators had to go looking somewhere else for their culprit. They then looked into the idea that this had been a thrill killing, possibly one that had just sprang out of opportunity, or even a copycat murderer who'd wanted to be like Ivan Milat, but every lead came back empty-handed. The case went cold, and a nation moved on. About 10 years later, an anonymous caller left a tip on a hotline describing a vehicle that could have been involved in the case, and finally there was movement again. The investigators had already determined that Fiona and John hadn't been killed at the truck stop they'd been found at, making it highly likely that some sort of vehicle had been used in their murders, either as the actual crime scene or as a way that the killer had moved the bodies from one place to the next. This call renewed momentum in what had become a cold case, but it unfortunately did not last. The lead fizzled out, and so did the investigation. In 2017, the authorities announced a $1 million reward for any information that could lead to the conviction of Fiona and John's killer or killers. During the announcement, Senior Detective Shiri said that it was highly likely that there are still people in the community who know something about the murders and the person or people who were responsible for them. He said, If you were in Bordertown between September 9 and October 18, 1990, and recall any details that might be pertinent to this case, please contact Homicide Squad. Homicide Squad detectives believe we have the ability to solve this case even after all this time. I'm asking anyone out there who does have information about Fiona and John's death, no matter what the information might be, please come forward and speak to police. It is absolutely no less than their family deserves after all this time. Now an adult and fighting to keep the memory of her sister's case alive, Barbie has continued to speak to media outlets and describe the impact the murder has had on her family, particularly their mother, Linda. She still cries like it was yesterday. It's still so raw. When someone dies of an illness, you can sort of understand it, but with murder there is so much anger, sadness, grief and trauma, and it affects everyone. About her sister, Barbie said that Fiona was a normal teenager going through ordinary teenager things. That happens to lots of kids, especially ones that had just had a parental separation like us. She never got a chance to come right again.